Most companies roll out Microsoft 365 Copilot expecting instant productivity boosts. But here's the catch. Without measuring usage and impact, those big expectations collapse fast. If your team can't prove where Copilot saves time and where it's ignored, you've just invested in another abandoned tool. So why do so many deployments fail quietly, and what can you actually do to make yours stick? Stay with me, because the missing piece isn't technical. It's all about turning metrics into a feedback loop that transforms Copilot from hype into measurable ROI. The hype versus reality of Copilot rollouts. Most leaders pitch Copilot as the silver bullet for productivity. The promise sounds simple. Roll it out, and from day one, the workforce magically produces more with less effort. That's the story most executives hear and repeat across town halls and leadership meetings. But then 6 months go by, and the feeling shifts. Instead of showcasing reports of dramatic gains, the organization starts asking quiet questions. Why aren't the efficiency numbers any different? Why are some teams still clinging to old processes? The hype begins to flatten into uncertainty, and the mood around Copilot changes from excitement to doubt. The expectation driving this disappointment is that Copilot acts like flipping a switch. Leaders often treat it as an instant upgrade to workflows, assuming that once employees have access, they'll figure out how to integrate it everywhere. It feels intuitive to think an AI assistant will naturally slot into daily tasks. The problem is that rolling out technology doesn't equal transformation. Without structure, without strategy, and without monitoring, Copilot becomes just another tool among dozens already available in the productivity stack. Employees will try it out, explore its features, and maybe even use it casually. But casual adoption is not the same as measurable improvement. Here's the disconnect. On paper, adoption might appear strong because licenses are in use, logins are happening, queries are being made, and yet inside the flow of work, no one actually knows whether those queries are relevant or valuable. Some employees experiment with Copilot to reformat text, while others use it to draft a single email a week. Nothing about that usage says anything about whether productivity has improved. That lack of visibility turns rollout success into guesswork. Soon, leadership starts relying on surface numbers without context. The illusion is there, but the underlying impact remains untested. If you've ever helped roll out Microsoft Teams without governing how groups or channels should be structured, you already know this story. At first, adoption rockets up, people are in meetings, sending chats, creating teams everywhere. But when governance is ignored, chaos compounds faster than adoption. Duplication spreads, abandoned spaces pile up, and engagement quality drops off harder than it grew. Copilot rollouts follow the same trap. Just because everyone has access and plays with it doesn't mean the organization is benefiting. It often means the opposite. Lots of scattered experimentation, with no pattern, no structure, and no way to scale the outcomes that work. A common pitfall is the assumption that once IT completes technical deployment, their job is done. Servers are running, identities are synced, licenses are assigned, and the box is ticked. That mindset reduces Copilot to a technical checkbox rather than treating it as a business transformation initiative. Success gets misdefined as we shipped it rather than it's making a measurable difference. The result is predictable. Organizations claim Copilot has been integrated, but the reality is most usage remains shallow. And shallow adoption doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The numbers back it up. Roughly 7 out of 10 Copilot deployments report no measurable return on investment after the initial surge of activity. Those are leaders checking dashboards filled with login statistics, but struggling to tie them back to any improvement in time saved or output produced. ROI freezes right where rollout started. Access has been granted, but productivity has not been proven. And because no baseline comparisons exist, there's no way to even know whether Copilot changed anything meaningful. Without proper measurement, the organization is essentially guessing. The warning signs often slip by quietly. One department swears by Copilot, but another barely touches it. Leaders chalk this up to differences in workload or maturity. But these patterns point to something much deeper, an uneven adoption curve that reflects a lack of guidance, training, and structure. If certain teams naturally discover value while others drift, you're not looking at success. You're looking at missed opportunity. The organization loses out on consistency, shared best practices, and economies of scale. And this is where the real game changer comes in. Early measurement doesn't just answer whether adoption is happening. It reveals how, where, and why. It identifies those uneven adoption patterns, not as curiosities, but as early warning lights. With the right approach, leaders can intervene, adjust training content, identify hidden champions, and redirect focus before momentum flatlines. Rolling out Copilot without measurement is like buying a plane without ever checking if it flies. You may have the engine, the wings, and the seatbelts installed, but until you verify it's airborne, success exists only in theory, which raises the bigger question: how do you know early on if your Copilot rollout is gliding towards success or dropping like a rock? The hidden metrics that predict failure. What if you could tell right from the start that your Copilot rollout was set to fail? Imagine spotting the red flags early before adoption stalls and the tool quietly becomes shelfware. That's not only possible, it's necessary. because by the time user complaints reach leadership, you're already too late. Copilot is one of those rollouts where the danger doesn't look like failure at first. It looks like activity, people log in, licenses get assigned, and surface numbers look healthy. But under the hood, the metrics that truly matter tell a different story. The reality is most organizations don't track the right signals. IT counts the number of licenses activated and assumes that equals success. On a spreadsheet, adoption looks impressive. Thousands of employees have access, and the system reports plenty of usage. Here's the problem. That number says nothing about whether the workforce is actually gaining value. It's the equivalent of tallying how many people opened Excel in a day without knowing if they built a budget or just sorted a grocery list. Activated licenses may prove reach, but they prove nothing about impact. Picture a fictional company with 2,000 Copilot licenses deployed across departments. On paper, the rollout looks like a win, but when the data is reviewed more closely, only about 20% of queries are tied to meaningful tasks, things like summarizing project notes, producing customer-ready content, or drafting reports. The rest fall into test queries, asking Copilot to write jokes, answer basic questions, or repeat functions that don't improve business workflows. In that picture, the rollout hasn't failed yet, but the early returns suggest it's already heading in the wrong direction. If leaders keep applauding increased usage without context, they'll call the rollout a success, while value quietly stalls. The same blind spots appear again and again. The first mistake organizations make is counting logins. High activity looks good at a glance, but it masks whether any of those interactions push work forward. The second mistake is ignoring context. Tracking queries without attaching them to tasks or domains gives a distorted view. That's how you end up lumping one user's casual tests in with another user's time-saving automation. And the third mistake is the lack of a baseline. Without knowing how long certain workflows took before rollout, there's no way to measure time savings, efficiency gains, or reduced error rates after Copilot enters the picture. Baseline data turns adoption into measurable outcomes. Without it, all you have are raw counts. So what should teams look for instead? Think about usage surface area. That means identifying how Copilot shows up in real workflows, not just that someone prompted it. Is it integrated into meeting prep, document drafting, analysis, or customer-facing tasks? Tracking surface area lets you see where Copilot becomes part of daily rhythm versus where it's treated like a novelty. A wide surface means employees are embedding it into multiple touchpoints. A narrow one signals risk. Copilot is confined to one or two small use cases and may never expand. This isn't just theoretical. Behavioral metrics tell richer stories about adoption than counts ever can. Frequency of task-specific queries shows whether Copilot supports critical workflows. Consistency of use across a department hints at whether champions are driving adoption or if success depends on individual experimentation. Even the variety of tasks Copilot supports can predict whether usage will plateau or spread. Research into technology uptake consistently shows that diversified embedded usage patterns lead to sustained adoption, while shallow repetitive use leads to drop-off. Copilot is no exception. Here's the key insight. Overlooked metrics reveal ROI clarity faster than any high-level dashboard ever will. If, within 60 days, you can tie Copilot queries to specific outcomes like document turnaround times or reduced manual formatting, you'll know adoption is scaling. If all you see is logins and one-off experiments, you'll know the rollout is sinking. That's the difference between waiting until quarter end to realize nothing improved and making course corrections in real time while momentum is still fresh. Once you understand these patterns, the challenge shifts. You've moved beyond the guesswork of licenses and logins. You know where Copilot is gaining traction and where it isn't. The real question now is how you capture this data in practice, and more importantly, how you make sure the insights feed back into the rollout instead of languishing in a static report. Turning raw data into a feedback loop. Capturing usage data is one thing, but most rollouts fail because no one bothers to loop that data back into the system. Numbers get collected, charts get built, and slide decks get circulated, but the insights die right there. The workforce keeps using Copilot the same way they did on day one, and nothing fundamentally changes. That's the gap between dashboards and feedback loops. A dashboard shows you what happened. A feedback loop says, now here's what we'll do about it. And without that shift, Copilot rollouts look busy but stay flatlined. Think about it this way. A static dashboard might tell you 10,000 prompts were entered in a month. Leaders feel reassured. There's activity, the tool is being used, the investment looks alive. But does anyone pause to ask what those prompts actually were, or whether they tie back to important business outcomes? That's the issue. Vanity metrics are easy to chase because they look impressive and can be shared with the board. But when you peel them back, they rarely drive decisions that improve adoption. Copilot ends up locked in a cycle of surface-level validation with no structural improvement. Here's a concrete picture. Imagine reviewing logs and realizing that 60% of all queries are variations of draft this email or rewrite this sentence. Useful, sure, but while email polish looks good in the short term, it says nothing about deeper automation wins. Meanwhile, whole areas of potential like document generation for complex contracts, summarizing long policy updates, or preparing data-driven reports remain untouched. If leaders stop at the surface, they'll celebrate usage but have no plan to expand it. The result? Copilot is doing repetitive work instead of broadening impact. And this is where a feedback loop comes into play. Once you know what the workforce is actually doing with Copilot, you can target training to change the pattern. If email drafting dominates usage, new learning sessions could highlight advanced scenarios, showing teams how Copilot can extract insights from meeting notes or build first drafts of proposals. Instead of employees repeating the one use case they figured out, training pushes them into new areas. That's how raw data shapes adoption. Without that loop, employees plateau quickly, convinced the tool has only one trick. The unfortunate reality is most organizations spend more time marketing adoption than supporting it. Big communications campaigns celebrate the launch. Posters, intranet banners, town halls where leaders talk about AI shaping the future of work. But excitement campaigns don't build capability. They create awareness without depth. The feedback loop flips that balance. It takes the energy leaders spent on marketing and directs it into practical skills employees can use. Adoption messaging makes people curious. Feedback-driven training ensures that curiosity translates into capability. A modern rollout doesn't need another static dashboard. It needs an engine that connects usage metrics back into the system. That's where Viva Insights Copilot Analytics fits. Instead of showing high-level numbers without context, it can drill into adoption patterns and point out areas where training or guidance might close the gap. Think of it less as reporting software and more as a tool for iteration. It continuously asks, what does this data suggest we should do differently tomorrow? That's the mindset shift many leaders miss. When viewed through a static report, data only tells the past tense of the rollout. What happened, how often, where spike points occurred. But in a feedback loop, those same numbers function like recommendations. Low diversity of queries becomes a signal that you need targeted training. Uneven adoption between departments becomes a flag to share best practices from high performers with lagging teams. Slow expansion into advanced use cases triggers coaching rather than panic. This approach shifts data from passive reporting to active guidance. And here's the kicker. Without a feedback loop, Copilot adoption remains static, locked on whatever habits employees stumbled into first. But once usage data flows back into training, communication, and process changes, adoption evolves. Every single interaction becomes sharper because the system learns not just from Copilot's AI, but from people's behaviors around it. That compounding effect makes each new rollout cycle stronger than the last. But optimization doesn't end with refining usage in isolated teams. The real opportunity comes from spotting those high-value practices and scaling them across the business. That's where feedback moves beyond dashboards and starts building shared playbooks for success. Scaling best practices across the organization. What happens when one team figures out how to use Copilot in a way that fundamentally changes how they work? The real opportunity begins when that success story isn't confined to that single team but becomes the template for the rest of the company. That's the moment Copilot shifts from being an interesting tool to a force multiplier. But here's the catch. Too often, those success pockets never make it past the department walls. Take HR as an example. Let's say they refine a set of Copilot prompts to streamline the onboarding process. Instead of manually pulling together documents, policy reminders, and training schedules, Copilot handles the heavy lifting. The result, onboarding paperwork gets cut in half and new employees come in with a clear, ready-to-go package. For HR, it's a game changer. They've saved hours of manual coordination and reduced errors that used to creep into the process. It's the kind of improvement that makes employees' first days smoother and HR more efficient at the same time. But unless that insight travels further, it stays a local win. Powerful, but isolated. And that's the tension every organization faces. In one part of the business, Copilot improves workflows dramatically, while across the hall, another department keeps using it to write simple emails and polish phrasing. The uneven spread wastes potential. The bigger risk is that leaders see inconsistent results across departments and assume Copilot itself isn't working, when in reality the problem is that best practices never scaled. The HR team doesn't have a channel to share its playbook, so the win sits behind closed doors instead of lifting the wider organization. The real task then is codifying and centralizing these wins so they don't depend on chance discovery. High-performing use cases shouldn't just be celebrated in that one department. They need to be documented, tested, and packaged in ways other teams can replicate. Structured prompt libraries, workflow guides, and playbooks become essential artifacts. Without them, Copilot improvements become scattered anecdotes with no cumulative effect. With them, the organization starts compounding insights instead of reinventing the wheel in each department. Centralized insights add another layer of value. It's not enough to collect what teams are doing. You need aggregated visibility into which workflows consistently generate efficiency spikes. A department head might polish their own processes, but only organizational analytics can pinpoint that onboarding, campaign reporting, policy drafting, or proposal generation consistently see the largest time savings. By elevating individual wins into collective intelligence, leaders can direct enablement efforts toward the highest yield areas. Without that step, every team is left guessing, each with their own isolated experiments. To make this tangible, picture a marketing team struggling with campaign reporting. They spend days compiling performance summaries, editing metrics, and aligning content into presentable reports. After seeing HR's structured prompt library around onboarding, they adapt the same idea. Instead of exploring Copilot on their own, they apply HR's shared framework, structured prompts, documented guardrails, and an example-driven library. Within weeks, their reporting cycle shrinks from days to hours. None of that would have happened if HR's discovery hadn't been communicated in a usable form. Sharing best practices doesn't just save time. It multiplies the impact across workflows no one anticipated at the start. That raises the point, how do these stories travel? Communication channels matter as much as the best practices themselves. Without a clear process to spread playbooks, lessons from one team never reach the next. Some organizations use internal knowledge portals, others lean on Yammer or Viva Engage groups, and others integrate playbooks directly into their learning platforms. The method isn't the hard part. The critical piece is ensuring new Copilot successes don't get buried in department silos. Structured sharing guarantees that a gain in one function doesn't just stop there, but acts as the launchpad for everyone else. And here's where the bigger picture starts to take shape. When best practices scale, Copilot stops looking like a personal assistant tucked into Word or Outlook. It begins to look like a strategic asset, shaping how the business operates end to end. Each department no longer treats Copilot as a standalone curiosity, but as part of a company-wide optimization engine. That transformation doesn't come from adding new licenses. It comes from replicating and reinforcing what already works. The fastest ROI in Copilot adoption isn't tied to raw access. It's in scaling winning patterns until they become organizational norms. Which leads to the bigger shift. Sharing across departments is powerful, but it's still only part of the story. The next challenge is moving from scattered wins and codified best practices into a full enterprise transformation. That requires leadership to stop treating Copilot as a tactical deployment and start framing it as a strategic lever. And that's where the conversation moves next. What it takes for Copilot to grow from tool into true strategic asset. From tool to strategic asset. At what point does Copilot stop looking like just another productivity tool and start creating real strategic impact? That's the turning point companies chase but often miss. Because on the surface, giving people access to Copilot feels like enough. It's new, it's advanced, and it seems logical that usage alone will translate into business outcomes. But what separates a tactical rollout from a real transformation is whether leaders capture the bigger picture, using insights to guide decisions, set priorities, and change how the business measures success. That's the shift from software to strategic asset. Copilot isn't simply a matter of deploying tech. It represents a cultural shift in how organizations think about decisions. When it's viewed only through an IT lens, it's treated as a support tool. Departments experiment with prompts, outputs improve locally, and the story ends there. But when it connects to the way leadership frames strategies, allocates resources, and measures return, it evolves from being a tool used by individuals into a framework that influences direction across the enterprise. In that context, Copilot isn't about replacing effort. It's about influencing how effort is prioritized and scaled. The challenge is alignment. Without tying Copilot to business goals, it defaults to being tactical. Maybe it reduces email drafting time or helps polish documents. Those are not meaningless wins, but they remain locked at the level of individual productivity. Local pain points get solved, but the larger outcome, whether projects complete faster, margins improve, or customers see value earlier, never materializes. That's why organizations that don't bring strategic context into their rollout often report inconsistent results. It's not that Copilot failed, it's that no one connected adoption metrics with what executive boards actually care about. The difference shows when analytics from Copilot usage are tied directly to ROI metrics. Instead of just counting how many people log in, leaders can measure reduced task hours across workflows, shorter cycle times on project deliverables, or increases in employee engagement because repetitive tasks dropped off their plates. Those numbers can speak in ways a login chart never could. Time freed from meeting preparation directly affects how quickly teams make decisions. Faster cycle times on contracts can improve cash flow and customer satisfaction. Higher engagement reduces attrition, which saves recruitment costs. In simple terms, metrics tied to outcomes are impossible for leadership to ignore. Picture a fictional executive team reviewing their quarterly insights. They don't just see Copilot usage up by 20%. Instead, they see something more useful. Average meeting preparation time per manager has dropped by 45 minutes. Scale that across hundreds of managers, and the time savings equates to thousands of hours. That's time redirected toward decision-making, coaching, or strategy work. Suddenly, Copilot isn't about a cool feature that writes bullet points. It's a clear driver for bottom-line efficiency. Executives now view Copilot usage not as a tech detail, but as a core performance factor. That shift happens because analytics aren't trapped at the operations level. They are elevated into executive discussions where priorities for resource planning and strategic focus are set. Leaders use them to decide where training budgets should expand, which business units are lagging in transformation, and how to model future productivity goals. In those conversations, Copilot goes from being an experiment to being infrastructure for decision-making. It actively informs choices about where to invest, what to streamline, and even how to measure competitive positioning. This also changes ownership. Early in a rollout, IT often controls the narrative since deployment sits on their desk. But once usage analytics show a measurable business effect, ownership starts to transition. Leaders across operations, finance, HR, and beyond want to weigh in because the data supports their missions. When Copilot becomes part of executive oversight, it validates IT's role while freeing it from being the single accountable party. That shift breaks the pattern where tech is deployed and then left to fend for itself without leadership buy-in. Skipping this step constrains results. When Copilot remains stuck at the tactical layer, it never delivers beyond individual productivity bumps. Without executive integration, ROI maxes out far below its potential. Companies that fall into this trap usually conclude the tool was overhyped, when in reality they failed to evolve how they measured and guided usage. Those who go further, embedding metrics into leadership conversations, push adoption into areas no one planned initially. That's the compounded return. Value discovered not only through use, but through strategy guided by actual results. The payoff is straightforward. Copilot only becomes a strategic asset when usage analytics consistently feed leadership decisions. Every prompt, every outcome, every win is no longer just a local improvement, but evidence that fuels executive-level choices. And this brings us full circle. Success can't be defined just by rolling out Copilot to the workforce. It depends on embedding measurement into the DNA of how the organization works, plans, and grows. Copilot isn't failing because the technology doesn't work. It's failing because most companies never measure what matters. They launch it, hope for gains, but never connect usage to real outcomes. That's why most rollouts fizzle after the initial excitement fades. If you want results, you need a feedback-driven measurement system from the start. Tools like Viva Insights, Copilot Analytics turn raw usage into actionable learning, showing where workflow gains actually happen. Transforming Copilot from hype into measurable ROI isn't optional anymore. It's the only way organizations will future-proof productivity and turn everyday adoption into strategic advantage.